Hello and welcome to something a little different. Not truly a how I paint things. I wanted to spend a little time doing some of my own hobby. The last time I did this, folks seemed to really enjoy it, so let's put the camera on what I'm doing today. Now these are the Gloom Trench 1926 British Infantry. It is an alternate history where atomic research began back in 1913, I think the lore says. And of course it ends with a hideous portal to another dimension where everything wants to eat us and is gribbly and gross. So the Great War never ended. And honestly, it's Great Weird War isn't something that I would have thought I would enjoy that much. But the miniatures themselves are so cool. And when I got my hands on them, they were very kindly sent along from the team at Fickle Dice Games, who are behind Gloom Trench. And I've printed them off and just straight away fell in love with them. There is so much cool stuff on these. So I've gotten out some paints today, and I'm going to show you how I painted all three of these guys. Yeah, let's have some fun. Included will be the base, a recipe for this. I'm actually going to show you on camera for a change how I did these ones. Let's get started. Before we get to the painting, just a real quick note on the miniatures themselves. These were all pre-supported. I haven't done anything to them. And they kind of follow that good old system of having big, thick supports on the feet and then little ones everywhere else. There's plenty of them, but it didn't take much to tidy this up at all. Just a quick buff with fine grain sandpaper, and it was easy. So really pleased with the pre-supports on that, which is not something I would ordinarily say, but since it was that simple, just wanted to bring that up if you're printing these at home. Once everything has been assembled and cleaned up, I've hit it with a primer spray of Xandri Dust. Now, it doesn't necessarily need to be a middling brown tone, but I've ordinarily found this the easiest way to get a nice, warm British uniform result. And we're actually going to be using a few Vallejo paints as well here today. And wouldn't you know it, English uniform. Now I've got this in a separate little bottle, a slightly larger one. Reason being, I've always found that English uniform doesn't mix very easily, even if you pop a couple of agitators in it in the Vallejo-sized dropper bottles. I don't know why it's that color specifically, but it never seems to quite come together right. So I've decanted it into one of these larger bottles, added a couple of agitators, and jobs are good. It always gives me that slightly greenish brown rather than brownish green finish. And that English uniform is where we're going to start. What I've got is just a little flat tip brush. Any old brush that you normally do your base coating with will work here, but I like these little cheap brushes because I can be quite brutal, really jamming them into any corners. I'm not worried about what happens to the bristles from there. So over pretty much all of the uniform. And if you have any really big gaps, this fella doesn't so much, but some of them have quite large holes in their capes, and if there's uniform showing through, just quickly bap some of this in there. Now I've applied that in 2 coats to get a solid color. You might not need to, but it's always worth letting the first coat dry and just taking a look to see if it is solid. We're going to move on to his webbing, and for this I'm going to use Morghast bone. Obviously the webbing that he's wearing it's not a real design. But there are a couple of elements which are going to be familiar, like the gas mask cape thing on his chest here. But otherwise, all of his little pouches, straps and what have you. A couple of coats of Morghast bone. This is fairly close to Iraqi sand from Vallejo, and it's a lovely color. Morghast bone is one of those quite light colors which is going to need at least 2 coats. I have done a 3rd on the larger, flatter areas. Not because it really needed it, but just because I wanted to make sure that my application was smooth before we get to the shading. What I've got here is tanned flesh from the Army Painter. And honestly, the skin, as I always say, can be painted any way you like. So I'm going to carefully just blob towards the front of his face. And I'm not worried if I hit his cape, but I do want to avoid the English uniform that I've painted on the wrap around his head so far. And also, something that I like about these guys, all of their trigger fingers are out of their gloves. So don't forget to coat that one in too. Most of these guys you'll see are wearing a male shirt, and I'm going to use Iron Hand Steel to paint this in, as well as the pretty wicked trench knife that they've got hanging from their hip. You'll find some of these fellas have got a little bit more of this up around their arms, shoulders and what have you. You'll see bits of the male shirt exposed, but obviously that'll depend on which miniature you're painting. Now for his puttees, I'm going to use Karak stone. You could just as easily use here Rakarth flesh. That'd be another quite good one. Honestly, grimy leg wraps, there isn't really a right color, and we are painting made up, never were soldiers anyway, so feel free to flub some of these details. Now that is most of his clothing done. If you like the way that I tend to speed paint my British stuff or other bolt action stuff, what you could do here would be to paint in his cape as well, and then hit this stage with the dark sand dry brush, or Tyrant Skull if that's what you're using from Citadel. As always, don't use a huge amount. There are some other guides where I've done that, so you can have a look if you'd like to look at that one. The British Commandos one, I'll link in the description, because that's probably the best example. But I'm going to continue painting this traditionally, let's say, so we're going to highlight him later. Anyhow, what I've got now, this is, there we go, beige brown from Vallejo, and I'm going to paint straight over the rifle and all over the black bits that are going to be black later too, because that way if I miss anything, it's not going to glow. Oh, also, if you can reach it, if you've got a fellow who's got the trench knife, just paint a little bit of wood onto the handle there. And while that's drying, I've poured out a little bit of black grey from Vallejo. You could use a true black here, it's not going to matter a huge amount. I'm going to paint in his boots and any of the other black details, such as on his rifle. On the handle of his blade, I'm going to get in there with a smaller brush to paint that. But yeah, this stuff covers wonderfully, and it looks a little more interesting once it's shaded than a true black would. But it's really a matter of style choice here, and there is no accounting for taste. Mine, of course, is impeccable. Something which I really appreciate about the rifles, they aren't 100% accurate, of course. These are probably they're inspired by the Leonfield, but they are a little bit thicker and chunkier. Someone has given some thought to this is a 3D print that needs to survive play on the table. Oh, it's nice. You know, not having to tiptoe around painting the bleeding thing, worrying about whether or not it's going to snap. Anyhow, we're going to move on to his cape, and here I've got Death Guard green. You could just as easily use something like Russian uniform. What I'm going to do is use quite a large flat brush to lay down most of the color. And then when I come near to, like around his front, what I'm going to do is swap to a smaller brush so I can paint up closer to his neck. But for these larger areas, just a quick flash over like that. We'll lay down our base coat. And we're probably going to need to come back and give this a second over top. Now here I'm going to use a dirty word and point out that in reality, that cape would probably be a wool, it would be a dark brown, but the green is going to work a little bit better. We have some freedom here to make things more interesting to look at. So what I'm going to use here, this is green grey from Vallejo. Now green grey has there are two paints called green grey in the range. Paint in his mittens here. One of them is quite dark and one of them is almost white, and we are going to use both of those green greys on this dude by the time we're finished. But don't mess them up, or mix them up rather, because yeah, when you see our pale green grey, you'll get a feel for why. Then the final one of our base coats is going to be refractive green from Vallejo, painted his helmet. Now, the same color used for things like ammo tins, the Vickers, mortar tubes, that sort of stuff. Here as well, Castellan green from Citadel will work quite well, although that one is very slightly lighter once it's finished and shaded, but again, we can make things up. Now once you are satisfied with that, you can load up your brush with your shade. Now I'm using here Agrax Earthshade. This is the old stuff, mostly because I've got a couple of pots of it and it would be silly not to use it, but I can't imagine that the new stuff, it's not going to make a huge difference. What we'll do is start bucketing this on and make sure, of course, you are really jamming it into the recesses, as always. Any areas around his face where it looks like it's pooling a little too much, just drag it around while it's still damp. And yeah, standard procedure here. We'll come back once this has had some time to dry, give it about 30 minutes somewhere warm, and see what we've got. And once it has dried, you'll have something that looks like this. There's not a reason you couldn't chuck him on the table. He's looking pretty grimy, got plenty of depth, looking good. But, as always, let's take it a little bit further. Now, the first place I'm going to start is by dry brushing his cloak, because if I skip over any bits with the green, I'll probably be able to highlight them back and tidy them up as we go. So green starts first. Now we're going to start, first of all, I have a raggedy old brush and some Nurgling green. Now I'm going to use both the dry version of this and the layer paint version. So it's very carefully, there we go, start dry brushing along the edges of the folds in the cape here. And as you get a bit more confident with what you're leaving behind, you can aim for his shoulders and what have you to catch those a little bit better. But I'm going to stray away from his face where possible, because in a second I'll turn to the layer paint and we will highlight that a little more traditionally. Now we've built up that texture and a little bit of color. It looks quite nice, but from the front, well, it's lacking because I don't want to have to repaint all of that. So I've got the layer paint version of Nurgling Green. Now, I've got both of them because I do use both of them quite a bit for different things. If you wanted to pick up just one, get the layer paint version. You can still dry brush with it. Take a little bit more practice, but don't worry. What I'm going to do here is to highlight the front of his cape, and as well, some of these areas that I have dry brushed, I'm going to brighten up and sharpen those highlights with this stage here. You'll find that the dry brush actually works as a very good guide for this. So anywhere that you want to tighten this up, make it look a little smarter, it's up to you. You can have some fun with this now. So it's looking fine from the front and from the back as well. I've really brightened up some of those edges. Looks pretty cool to me. And it'll look better once it's varnished too. It's always an important point to remember. What I'll turn to now is a smaller brush. I'm going to use a small layer brush for all of this stuff. And some Ushabti bone. And I'm going to start highlighting the webbing. Now, this is one where you can really go as much or as little as you like. You can go overboard quite quickly. But I'm just going to pick out edges and towards the center of some of the flat areas, just to make these a little more interesting to look at. You'll probably see I'm not interested in perfectly matching the edges of everything. I'm really more painting a little bit of texture onto them, so short, scratchy lines will work quite well. What I've got next, this is another one of my little bottles. This is English uniform with Iraqi sand mixed in, at about 3 or 4 to 1. It works super well as a highlight for English uniform once it's been shaded. It's also what I use as the base for my sun-bleached kiwis, but obviously in this case, just a highlight. Now it will look quite extreme going on, but it will darken down a fair bit as it dries. So if you do follow this precisely, you'll be able to be a little more generous with this than you might think. But I'm just going to draw some of the shape back into this uniform. Now, even from a distance, that'll add quite a bit to the look of the miniature. Now, do you remember me mentioning that really light green-grey? Well, what I've done is mixed roughly half and half, that with the darker green-grey. I'm going to use this to gently poke along some of the knuckles, the raised bits in the gloves, because I want to try and make them look a little woolen. So rather than painting straight and perfect lines, I want it to be a little bit scratchy as it goes on. So particularly up here at the wrist. But yeah, that might be a bit much. See how this turns out. And then just a little bit of that neat green-grey. I've watered this down, so I've got a fair bit of control to it. What I'm going to do is very carefully tickle at the edges of the woolen areas. So not very much on my brush, as you'll see. I just want to make this look a little more pale and knitted. That's not too bad. That looks about right. What I've got next is Cadian Flesh Tone, and we're going to highlight his skin. Now, like most ways, we're going to leave most of the tanned flesh shaded in the recesses. We want to paint over most of the skin using this. So take your time here, particularly up around the face, because chances are good you're going to end up clipping the edge of the the cape. But try not to worry too much about that, because you can go back with your Nurgling green. Now, my suggestion when it comes to painting the bottom lip is just to leave it, because it will still be shaded from whatever you used, but it won't have as dark a line around it as the rest of the mouth. So if you leave it painted and don't highlight it, it's actually going to look much more natural. But speaking of highlighting, because I can't leave well enough alone, I have some flat flesh here from Vallejo. You could use Kislev flesh if that's what you've got, but I happen to have this sitting in front of me, so just a little bit of this on nose, cheekbones, and if you can reach your model's chin, paint his chin, and let's dab in his knuckles and fingertips as well. If you do want to highlight the helmet, then what you could do would be to run along the edge with a little bit of the darker green-gray, but I'm not going to. I don't think it's going to add a lot to the miniature by the time we're finished, and I've got some plans for that a little bit later. What I am going to do now is to varnish the miniature, and whether you're spraying this on or brushing it on, I'm doing it now because the last highlight I want to apply, I want it to be quite shiny. So I'm going to put my varnish down now so it doesn't take that shine off. I'm using here, this is Varnish Plus from Instar, and this stuff is magic. Just apply a layer of it and then guide it away so it doesn't pull too much. But yeah, let's come back in a second once this is dried. You'll see what a difference this makes. Now, doesn't that just make a world of difference? If you ever have to worry about, oh, my shade's dried shiny, don't worry about it. Find yourself a good matte varnish. You should be varnishing your miniatures anyway, because it will make such a difference to the finished product. But mentioning the varnish, there was one thing I wanted to stay shiny and not flat. And for this, what I've got, this is Vallejo Gunmetal from the Model Air range. What I'm going to do is just a few little lines of this on, funnily enough, the gunmetal. And there we go, there is our finished infantryman. But how to base these guys? That is the $64,000 question. You'll see I've got a couple lurking in the background here that I've already done. But what to do for the basing? And I think I've got an idea. Let's crack on. All right, I've got it. I'm going to start first of all with a layer of Sterland mud. Now, everything that I do to this fella, of course, I'm going to do to the other two as well. I don't need this to be particularly, I don't need this to be multi-leveled. I don't need to spend a lot of time bulking out the shape here. Just want a little bit of texture. And you'll see where I'm going with this in a minute. Now, once that has dried, what I've got is my secret weapon. This is a little bit of packing foam, which has been torn to shreds, folded over a couple of times, so I've got nice random splotches. And I'm going to use some dryad bark. I've got that on my palette, and let's bap it off on a bit of paper until I get random splodges. Now what we'll do is add some of this to our miniature. You don't have to add much. Like, don't go nuts with it and just completely cover them, because you'll undo all of your hard work. But along the cape and what have you, let's just dab a little bit of grub and mess, and on the lower parts of his legs as well. Now we'll add some dry mud by doing the same thing again, but instead this time I have Steel Legion Drab. I'm going to concentrate towards the edges of his cape, places where this would dry naturally. Now when that's finished, I've also quite roughly dry brushed the base with the same. I'm going to use a little bit of super glue to apply a couple of tufts. And once that has settled, I've got here some Valhallan Blizzard. And this stuff, it is bar none one of the best and easiest to use sort of snow effects I've ever come across. Because it's got a slightly fibrous kind of consistency to it. You'll see it looks very white going on, but as it dries, some of that's going to end up a little more translucent, and I love it. Really work it into everything. Do make sure that you're putting a little bit of it on the tufts themselves, but away you go. Cover this in, well, not cover it, but put a fair bit of this on. And then the day will come when I don't say grab a scrankly old brush, but it's not today. What I'm going to do is just poke this around a little bit so that it looks a little more natural than big clumps that have come off of a splashing tool. And as well, once you've got a little bit of this worked into your brush, what you can do is start just settling it up on his shoulders, its helmet, anywhere that a little bit of snow would collect on a really cold day. So I've had some good reference for this the last couple of days. And then finally, once that snow flock has dried, I've gone and hit the bases with some dryad bark to tidy them up a little bit, and you'll see how they aren't as gloopy and shiny as they look when the Valhalla Blizzard first goes on. You're really looking for the physical bits, those little fibrous, flocky parts that are in there. They are what's going to remain behind. Otherwise, you're just going to have little splashy bits of a slightly translucent whiteness. So be a little more generous with it than you might think. But there it is. There are the Gloom Trench British Empire painted, and I got to admit, I had a real blast painting them. They are something that, I mean, I've done British infantry on the channel maybe not a dozen times, but quite a few times. But these have such an interesting twist on them that I had to tackle them again, and I've had a lot of fun. These are just so cool. So you can go and check these out. They are available through my mini factory, but Fickle Dice also do physical prints. So if you don't have a printer, you're not going to miss out if you want to use these guys for something. So again, thank you very much to Fickle Dice for sending these along for me to have a play with. Really appreciate it, and I'm probably going to end up printing a whole bunch more. As well, thank you very much to Exa23 Games for the light and sound equipment, and all of my wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my producers Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Andrew, Rod, and Jimmy. Your support means the world, folks. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time on it all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.